Welcome to the World United. Welcome to the World United.
Baker. So Ian is a historian, he's an author, National Geographic explorer. He's been awarded as one of the top explorers by National Geographic. We are so excited to listen to you, sir. And your topic today is Tantric Yoga in the Modern World. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me now. I just turned off my mute button. Yes. So, yes, it's a great pleasure to be participating in this wonderful event that has been put together by everyone participating in it. And I would also just like to start out by saying, when I was invited to speak and to choose a category, it was quite difficult because in a certain sense, my title now, being Tantric Yoga in the Modern World, fits obviously under yoga. But in a certain sense, what I was really thinking to speak more on as I looked at what the other speakers were addressing, I wanted to address this issue of Tantra. So I was actually originally had a title of Tantric Spirituality to try to bring more light as a historian into what Tantra means in terms of spirituality generally. And so that's really more of what I will speak about, because I'm not a yoga teacher per se, although certainly I know I've done a book on Tibetan yoga called Principles and Practices of Tibetan Yoga, and doing another one on method and techniques. And certainly it's something that I've practiced deeply over many decades, living in Nepal as I did for over 20 years. But in this talk, in these 15 minutes, and I'm just looking at the clock just so that I can time myself, I wanted to, because various speakers have addressed in wonderful ways, just in the larger sense of what Tantra, but what I wanted to do in the hope just to kind of illuminate really what Tantra is, because there's so much misunderstanding of it in the modern world. But if we look historically, when we see when the first Tantras, which were originally texts, when they first emerged, let's say in the 6th century in India, both in the Hindu tradition and the Buddhist tradition, what we saw was really a revelatory vision of spirituality, which was no longer dividing, if we think of it in Christian terms, the spirit and the flesh, the spiritual from the material. It was this wonderful integration. And not only that, but it was a kind of a spiritual path that kind of emerged within not just Hinduism and Buddhism, but also, as we see later a burn in the Tibetan tradition, within Jainism, really as a kind of syncretic, integrative spirituality that was dissatisfied with the kind of transcendent spirituality that we could see in certain trends in world spirituality, where it becomes either through ascetic practice or through a belief system that tends to denigrate the material world. And at least from my understanding, the beauty of Tantra is this celebration of our embodied natures. And we see that also expressed as many speakers have commented on this, the creativity and the artistic expression that is so profoundly evident within the Tantric tradition. So for example, there's an exhibition going on right now in London called Tantra, from Enlightenment to Revolution. It just started a few weeks ago. It will go to the end of January, and it's very revolutionary in my mind to see, for example, Tantra coming an exhibition at the heart of London at the time of COVID, at the time of a pandemic, trying to bring about a reappreciation for what Tantra is in the world. And so they're looking, of course, at Tantra through its material culture, but at the same time looking at it as a spiritual path that is very much about bringing together the spirit and the body, if you will, and that's of course what its beauty is. And so I wanted to then speak a little bit about this idea of the Tantras, as I said, being originally referring to texts both in the Shaivite as well as the Buddhist tradition, that in some ways overturned earlier ways in which spirituality had been expressed. So, for example, if we see it both in the Hindu and the Buddhist traditions, what Tantra introduced was a complete sort of overturning and rejection of the rigid kind of caste hierarchy that was also implicit within certain Brahmanical, with the Vedic tradition, for example. So the Tantras were a way of bringing about a whole new approach, not just to spirituality, but to within kind of its own sort of sociological expression as well. And particularly in the Buddhist tradition, when we see the so-called Four Noble Truths of the Buddha, which were his sort of first truths supposedly given to his original disciples, the first teaching was that all life is characterized by dukkha. So as we saw in the last presentation, a word that's translated either as misery or as suffering or as discontent, dissatisfaction. And this, of course, is something we can all relate to in our experience. And other speakers have also talked about how, of course, the spiritual path is a way of trying to identify ourselves with a larger reality in which we are no longer conditioned excessively by our thoughts, emotions, and the kinds of limiting beliefs and attitudes that such identification brings about. So in the Buddhist tradition, when we see how this was turned around, it was really the introduction of Buddha nature. So an enlightened nature of wisdom and compassion that's also inherently blissful, that being the actual essential nature of ourselves. So all of the Buddhist tantras, let's say in the Tibetan tradition, which is the tradition that I've mostly practiced in and written about, it's about disidentifying with our own personal egoic consciousness, if you will, and identifying increasingly with the kind of increased capacities and compassionate disposition and wisdom inherent in the Buddha as a state of being, of awakened being, as the word Buddha originally means. So this was really where Tantra was revolutionary in the history of Buddhism, as well as within Shaivism. Another very, very key point that I think the Tantras introduced into both traditions was a revalorization of the feminine, something that had been clearly denigrated within the patriarchal, caste-ridden society. So we see in the Shaiva tradition, for example, with the growth of the Shakta tradition that grew out of Shaivism, this was paralleled exactly by the revelation of the so-called Yogini Tantras in the so-called highest yoga tantras of the Buddhist Vajrayana, the tantric Buddhism in India, prior to its going to Tibet. So here we see this valorization of the feminine principle, the celebration of the unity of opposites, if you will, the complementarity of opposites. So we see a vision of unity expressed as a dynamic polarity, expressed there, very vibrantly in the arts, in ritual, in sacred dance, and in esoteric rituals that have, of course, been the things that have been somehow focused on in the West and in what's often called California Tantra, which is a diminishment of what Tantra, as in a larger sense, introduced, which we can see in the Buddhist sense as being the absolute unity of so-called samsara and nirvana. So in other words, nirvana as the state of transcendent peace in which we are no longer identified with our transient embodiment, but rather with Buddha mind, and that this is completely coextensive with samsara, with the world, with worldly life, but in a way that we have entered into that life in a very, very different and more expansive way. And in that sense too, just for those who may not be familiar with the word so much tantra, but what we understand even etymologically, it's been translated in varying ways, but what we understand, and I'm not a Sanskritist per se, but those who are will, it's tan, this sense of the extension, tra, this we had in the Buddhist sutras, for example, it's the same etymological root as the English word suture, which is to sew, it's the thread that connects, but in tantra expanded on what the Buddhist sutras, for example, presented by, we see in Tantra being the womb on which the threads of Tantra, reality were woven. So you kind of get a much more comprehensive tapestry of experience that the Tantras as an extension or expansion of the Buddhist sutras represented. And we see a similar phenomena happening already from 9th, 10th century, for example, and with the Kashmiri form of Shaivism, in which as I said again, the Shakta tradition, the valorization and veneration of the feminine principle as the matrix of reality. So in that context, I wanted to also mention, we tend to also exoticize so much of our spiritual traditions in the sense that, quite rightly, what we see, having happened in India was a systemization of spiritual insights that often went far beyond what occurred in Europe, in the West, although, of course, these traditions did exist in the West as well, but they were often heavily suppressed by the Judeo-Christian traditions that really, as we know, kind of destroyed the mystery schools of the ancient Hellenic world due to the rise of what became a very politicized form of spirituality based upon authoritarian control, a disempowering of the individual. So what we see in Tantra, on the other hand, is a complete counter movement to that, which is through its initiatic processes, an empowering of the individual to become the master of their world and of their experience, with the basis of wisdom and compassion as its framing orientation. So in that context, what I also wanted to speak about in the remaining minutes was just, again, we think of Tantra as something that emerged, as it did, in India, went across the Himalayas into Tibet and to neighboring countries, went to China, went to Japan, so across Asia. But when we look at where, for example, in Tibetan tradition, where they actually maintain that the tradition emerged from, was in a land, kind of a semi-legendary land called Udiana, which is now held to have been in the Swat Valley in Pakistan, sort of in the lower foothills of the Hindu Kush. This was essentially an area that was on the ancient Silk Roads between the East and West. And we actually have accounts of Alexander the Great, for example, already 3rd, 4th century BC, when he traveled in this area, found existing in the Swat Valley a cult of Dionysus. So Dionysus, as we know, from the Western tradition, was a very, very embodied and sensual approach to spirituality, which again, unlike the Apollonian traditions, saw that this ecstatic transcendence of our limitations could be achieved through an approach that often differed from, you could say, more staid approaches to spirituality. We also know that with the Arabic invasions of this region of northwestern India, from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries AD, that over 1,400 Buddhist monasteries were destroyed. Monks and nuns in those monasteries were forced to flee, many of them heading up, obviously, in the valleys up into the upper Hindu Kush valleys, such as Swat. And it would make sense that in this area, that even from the time of Alexander, we saw a Dionysian cult. We also see the archaeological record of a very established viniculture, of the wine pressing. We can almost see the birth of Tantra as something that occurred as a result of these kind of, in some ways, very confrontational contacts between East and West. We also see in some of the iconography of the Mahasiddhas, the great sages of the Tantric tradition, often depicted much as Selenius, the great guru of Dionysus, was depicted. So I just want to sort of end with that note of just looking again of a way of trying to understand what Tantra offered and continues to offer as this stretching of our concepts and sometimes limited ideas about what spirituality is, so that we can see it as something that encompasses our everyday experiences, and about integrating, in that sense, above and below, spirit and the flesh, if we look at it in sort of the Western tradition, but in samsara and nirvana, if we look at it in the Buddhist context. And if we look at it in that way too, we can also go back into the various earliest roots of, the Greco-Hellenic traditions. And we see also there that there were spiritual traditions that have largely been kind of eclipsed as a result of the kind of rise of Christianity. We see there were actually practices in the pre-Socratic philosophers of incubation that involved dark retreat, that involved spirituality as it emerged within the dream world. And so we see even some of the most esoteric practices that we associate with Tibetan Tantra, for example, as having existed long before in ancient Greece. But again, something that has been historically kind of eclipsed as a result of the Judeo-Christian narrative. And in that, and sort of as a final note in that, we can also look at, Epicurus, for example, and we look at the whole history and evolution of Greek philosophy. There's a lot of emphasis often now put on the Stoics as a kind of almost an approach to life, which sort of takes things as they come, and parallels have been made within Stoicism and Buddhism as a way of also kind of dealing with, to use Shakespeare's terms, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. In other words, just the inevitable sufferings and dukkha that arise in life. But we can also see in Epicurus and in the Epicureanism that developed, often, again, sort of looked at askance as a form of hedonism by those who don't know its root texts. But if we really look at the early roots of Epicureanism, we can really see an incredible parallel with Tantra. In the sense that it was celebrating this unity of the sensual world and the spiritual world. And this idea, it was really as a path to living well, living in unity with all others on a personal, interpersonal, and ultimately transpersonal level. So that's really all what I wanted to sort of contribute to the discussion here, which has been so exciting for me to learn about all of the diversity of views entering into this. But this was just a little appeal to a kind of a deeper appreciation and understanding of what Tantra is in the field of spirituality as a view of life that did not admit that spirituality could be in any way separated from our material existence. So thank you very much. That's all I'll say on the matter at the moment, and look forward to the panel discussion later.
So a small token of appreciation for you, Ann Baker, for your immense research, immense work, immense activity. The World Native proudly presents Ann Baker for being an esteemed speaker in the World Parliament on Spirituality, 3rd edition, Europe chapter. Thank you very much.